Hello and welcome to this very special webinar, Afterlives of the Kingdom of Haiti, 1820 to 2020, Art, Refinement and Material Culture. My name is Esther Chadwick. I'm a lecturer at the Courtauld Institute of Art, and I'm delighted to be hosting this evening's event, or this morning's, depending on where you are. Wherever you are joining us from in the world, a very warm welcome to the Courtauld's virtual research forum. I'm very honoured and humbled to be joined today by experts in the field of Haitian history and culture, and also by a very special guest, the Haitian American soprano, Melissa Joseph, who will be singing us out. More on that later. Before we get started, I'd like to say a few words about the rationale and the context for this webinar. This year, 2020, marks the bicentenary of the death of our central protagonist, King Christophe, and the definitive end of his reign over the Kingdom of Haiti in 1820. Christophe was born enslaved on the island of Grenada in the British Caribbean in the 1760s. But rose to a position of power in French Saint-Domingue, or what was soon to become Haiti, during the Haitian Revolution, serving as a general under Toussaint Louverture. We'll be hearing about how in the years after the Haitian Declaration of Independence, he sent shockwaves around the Atlantic world when he crowned himself king in the northern state of Haiti in 1811 and ruled for the next decade. Against a backdrop of continuing transatlantic slavery and increasingly entrenched racist attitudes, his fledgling kingdom sought to nurture a culture of refinement through portraiture, architecture, dress, music, and literature that fundamentally challenged assumptions about Black degeneracy and Haitian misrule. He drew on his African heritage and consciously positioned himself as a new world ruler, the first Black king in the Americas. But he also cultivated a self-image that drew explicitly on European aesthetics. I'm a historian of British art, and what drew me to Christophe, beyond the inherent importance of the history of the Haitian Revolution and its aftermath in shaping the world we inhabit today, but what drew me particularly to Christophe is that as part of his positioning on a global stage in the early 19th century, he turned, among other things, to British art and to British artists to fashion the currency, the dress, the crown jewels, the portraiture, and the regalia of his court. So it's these things, their contexts and their afterlives, that form the backbone of today's webinar. We'll be hearing from Professor Marlene Doubt, who will give us an overview of Christophe's court and its historical context, from Tabitha McIntosh in more detail about the art and material culture of Haiti in this period, from Dr. Nicole Wilson on court dress and Marie-Louise, the Queen of Haiti, from Joseph Gardy-Lissard, an expert in Haitian numismatics, and from Henry Stoll, a scholar of music at Christophe's court, who's been working in close collaboration with Melissa Joseph, who, as I said, is going to be singing us out today. Thank you to all of you wonderful participants for being willing to share your work and your knowledge with us. The idea for this gathering of scholars came from conversations with Tabitha McIntosh, who will be presenting to us in a moment, as I said. And for making the ideas that came out of those conversations into a reality, I owe a very special thanks to today's co-organizer, Dr. Nicole Wilson of the Institute for Black Atlantic Research at the University of Central Lancashire in the UK. Nicole has been absolutely instrumental, not only in connecting the webinar's participants, but in securing funding for this event from the Paul Mellon Centre in London. And we're very grateful to the Paul Mellon Centre for their support. Thank you. October the 6th is Henri Christophe's birthday. What better day to hold this webinar? But it also happens to be Nicole's birthday too. So a very happy birthday to you, Nicole. Just a quick note on the format. So the webinar is going to be divided into 3 main segments. Firstly, Professor Doubt will give us a broader overview of the historical context, followed by presentations from Tabitha and Nicole. Then we'll hear from Joseph on Haitian currency and coinage. And the final section, led by Henry and Melissa, will look at the music from Christophe's court. I and my co-host Nicole will be introducing our speakers as we go on. Unfortunately, we don't have capacity for an audience Q&A session today, but if you in the audience have any comments or follow-up questions, please do feel free to write to me or to Nicole and we'll pass them on. We'll put our email addresses on a slide at the end of the webinar. And don't forget, you can also tweet using the hashtag Afterlives of Haiti. Throughout the webinar, we'll be exploring historical connections between Britain and Haiti. But this event is also about forging relationships in the present. And so I'm very pleased to welcome representatives from the Haitian Embassy in London and the Haitian Chamber of Commerce in the UK to say a few words before we begin. So if I could now invite Gaël and Michelet to please turn on your cameras. Gaël Lissard is the Haitian Chargé d'Affaires in London, and Michelet, who I hope we will see in a second, is Vice President of the Haitian Chamber of Commerce in Great Britain. Thank you both so much for being with us today. I'm going to hand over to you for a few brief words. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. It is such a pleasure being here, even if virtually, with everyone this evening. Haiti and the United Kingdom has, unbeknown to most, have shared one of the longest forms of diplomacy in the world. Both kingdoms recognized early on the necessity of a potential alliance. Cultural diplomacy rapidly began to dominate as both islands admired and appreciated the customs and tradition that were emerging on their respective territories in the wake of the 19th century. King Christophe has left an indelible mark in the history of both Haiti and of the United Kingdom. His heritage has transcended time and remains a key component in retracing the common history of the two countries. It is with great honor and pleasure that the embassy extends its appreciation to the Courtauld Institute for hosting this amazing event, and also a special thank you to Esther and Nicole for bringing all this to life and celebrating the life of this icon of world history.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Michelet Romulus. So I am the Vice President of the Haitian Chamber of Commerce here in Great Britain. We started operating back in 2015. And since then, we've been actively involved in promoting trade between the UK and Haiti, building up also a network of business partners for both countries, and also cultural events and activities. Among those cultural activities, we've had the pleasure to do footage / documentary with Dr. Nicole on Marie-Louise locations where she actually lives across the UK. And we hope this will be released pretty soon. Just to be short, we do have a website, which is Haitian Chamber of Commerce in Great Britain, haitianchambergb.com. There you can find a lot of information about our services and activities. Feel free to send us an email if you have any questions about Haiti or doing business in Haiti. We'll be glad to respond. And just to finish, we do have some Haitian businesses here. If you would like to try some Haitian food, you can check out Grill Shack, Tiki Bar, or Cafe 1788 if you really want to enjoy some strong Haitian coffee. Thank you for organizing this again, to all the panelists, and let's enjoy the show.
Thank you so much, both of you, Gaël and Michelet, for being with us, for your words, for your support. I really hope we get to meet in person at the restaurant when this is all over. We're so happy to have you with us. So Marlene, could I now invite you to please turn on your camera and unmute yourself. Now, to introduce us to the Kingdom of Haiti and its historical context, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Marlene Doubt, Professor of African Diaspora Studies in the Carter G. Woodson Institute and the Program in American Studies at the University of Virginia. Professor Doubt is a leading voice in Haitian studies, the author of numerous groundbreaking publications, including Baron de Vaté and the Origins of Black Atlantic Humanism, which was published by Palgrave in 2017, and Tropics of Haiti, Race and the Literary History of the Haitian Revolution in the Atlantic World, 1789 to 1865, which was published with Liverpool in 2015. It is a real honor to have you with us, Marlene. So welcome, and please take it away.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and it's so nice to virtually meet everyone else. So good afternoon and good evening to those of you in Europe and the UK. It is such a pleasure to have been invited here to talk to you about the Royal Kingdom of Haiti. And so I wanted to thank you all for coming out to this webinar today, for attending this event. But I would also like to thank Nicole Wilson and Esther Chadwick for hosting and for inviting me to participate, and of course everyone at the Courtauld Institute who made this event possible. So I have the monumental task of taking you from Christophe's birth to essentially his tragic suicide. So I'm just going to dive right in and try to see if I can get this all done in about 12 minutes. As Esther said, please feel free to email if you have any questions, as I will be going quite fast. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, if I can manage that. And hopefully you'll all be able to see it. Just a moment here. All right. So I want to begin with talking about how we know what we know about Christophe. These are the questions that probably those of us who study the kingdom get the most. And so Christophe was born in Granada, as you just heard, on October 6, 1767. And we know this because numerous documents produced in the kingdom describe this, naming his birthday and his place of birth. And also a lot of people who knew him in French Saint-Domingue describe his birth on the island of Granada and his early years. So that's how we know this element of Christophe's history. In between his birth and his fighting in the Battle of Savannah during the American Revolutionary Wars in Georgia for the French chasseurs volontaires is a little bit murkier, but we know that on October 9th, 1779, he was a part of this of these chasseurs, and again, because documents from the kingdom themselves describe his participation, and also people who knew him from his revolutionary days in French Saint-Domingue. And you'll see October 9th there, so just a few days from now. October is a quite momentous month in Haitian history. On Christophe's birthday, his tragic suicide occurs on October 8th, 1820. He fought in the Battle of Savannah, beginning on October 9th, but also October 17th marks the tragic death of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, which I will get to in just a moment. So we now have to introduce another protagonist and character into our story. So we know that by the time the Haitian Revolution breaks out in August of 1791, so the slave revolts and rebellions that end up sparking this 13-year war, we know that Christophe is in French-claimed Saint-Domingue. He's living in the city of Cap-Haïtien. This is going to be his home city, the one he adopts. He lives there even under Dessalines' rule, and he also has a home in Millau, not far from there. He will pretty quickly encounter Toussaint Louverture after the start of the revolution. Toussaint Louverture, of course, as we know, rises to prominence. By 1793, he's definitely the most important of the future Haitian revolutionary generals, although he never gets to see Haitian independence. By August of 1793, he's forced the French commissioners to abolish slavery on the island of, or on the French part of Saint-Domingue. And By February 1794, the French National Assembly is going to follow suit and ban slavery throughout the entire French Empire. While this is happening, Toussaint Louverture is, after reuniting with the French, going to have to fight off the Spanish and the British, and he's eventually going to help the French to strike a treaty with the Spanish, whereby they cede the island to the French, and he's also going to help get rid of the British. By 1801, Toussaint Louverture is Governor General of the colony. In 1801, he also proclaims himself Governor General for life, with the right to name his successor. This really gets under the skin of Napoleon Bonaparte, who had rose to power in France, who had overthrown the French Directory, and then he sends what is known as the Leclerc expedition, which arrives in Saint-Domingue in the late part of January 1802. Now I have this picture of the burning of Cap here, which is actually an illustration of an event that happened in 1793, because this is where Christophe really kind of forcefully enters the story with fire, not necessarily this fire, but the fire that he sets to the city of Cap-Haïtien in 1802. So in order to prevent Leclerc's troops from landing in Cap-Haïtien, Henri Christophe obstinately says, you know, you're not landing here without the assent of Toussaint Louverture, who is not in the city at that time. He has this city set on fire. And so this is sort of one of his claims to fame. Yet, only a few months later, Christophe will take a meeting with Leclerc, and Leclerc will ardently try to convince him that it is not the aim of the French government to bring back slavery. Christophe will then join forces with the French. He will soon also be joined by Dessalines and other key French generals. Toussaint Louverture, essentially despondent, has no choice but to also capitulate and agree to recognize the authority of Leclerc as Captain General of the colony. Toussaint Louverture will eventually be arrested in June of 1802. He's summarily arrested, I should say, sent on a ship with his family to France. He will die in a prison in the Four du Joux mountains due to neglect, pneumonia, various ailments that were not taken care of while he was in French captivity. And I wanted to show you this image because it's one you see much less often. Some of you may have never seen it, from Vandenesse Ducasse's, a reproduction of it, I should say, 1896 play, Toussaint au Fort du Joux. And what you're looking at for that newspaper article is a Times of London reporting the death of Toussaint Louverture, and they report this on May the 3rd, 1803, but Toussaint Louverture actually died, according to the autopsy records, on April 7th, 1803. Now we have three central figures who will enter the frame. Christophe is going to be one of them, Jean-Jacques Dessalines is another, and Alexandre Pétion. And together they will eventually reunite to drive the French out of Saint-Domingue, whereby Dessalines will become Emperor of Haiti. Now, of course, those of you who are very familiar with Haitian history know that Dessalines' reign does not last long. He is eventually ambushed by members of his own military on the infamous Pont Rouge outside of Port-au-Prince, and this is Jean-Claude Sévère's famous painting of these tragic events. Christophe very quickly will be named provisory president of Haiti. Although the constitution issued in 1806, he doesn't have much to do with it. He's not one of the 64 signatories. And so he eventually flees to the northern part of Haiti, where he's from, again, to build his capital in the city of Cap-Haïtien, leaving Alexandre Pétion, now a key rival, to be ruler over the south of Haiti and eventually over the southwest, which at some point is ruled by a former Haitian Revolutionary General, André Rigaud, as well. And so from 1807 until 1811, Haiti is split into two separate states run by two separate presidents. Eventually, Jean-Pierre Boyer, after the death of Pétion in 1818, will assume control over the southern region with a little bit of a stronghold here below Saint-Marc that is sort of a rebel stronghold that was never captured by either of the leaders. Now, if we back up to 1807, we see Christophe's title, which is very interesting. He gives himself the title of President and Generalissimo of the Forces of the Earth and C of the State of Hayti. Now, I always qualify this to say that Christophe was president over northern Haiti, but it is true that the state he builds, he doesn't say that he's only president over the northern portion. He essentially intends, as does Pétion, to one day reunite the two sides of Haiti and to eventually lead both sides. This, of course, leads to the 13-year civil war that will only end after Christophe dies in 1820. In March of 1811, Christophe announced his intention to become King of Haiti. He issued a new constitution to that effect at the very end of March, and he and his wife, Queen Marie-Louise, will be coronated by Father Courtauld Brel, a French priest, on June 2nd, 1811. Now, so many people ask me, and the rest of the panel probably gets this question a lot as well, why did Christophe make himself a king? Well, the truth of the matter is, even though in the United States they wrote about this in a very astonishing manner, the truth is that he became a king in a world of kings. This was a completely normal and ordinary method of governing, and it's one that Christophe decided to adopt as well. As king, he oversaw the completion of the Palais de Sans-Souci, the famous palace in Milo, Haiti, which was one of his beloved cities. Again, even under Dessalines, he often resided there and had a home there. These are three separate, well, two renderings of it and then one image of it today. It was partially destroyed, as you see there, in an earthquake that struck Cap-Haïtien in 1842. The remains of the palace, nonetheless, today are considered a UNESCO heritage site, along with the citadel, which I will show you in just a moment. King Henry lived in this palace with Queen Marie-Louise Croix-David of Haiti. And if a lot of stories about Christophe are apocryphal, for example, if you've ever read Alejo Carpentier's The Kingdom of This World, you can find the most wild stories repeated there. But stories of the Queen are also quite apocryphal as well. And in Charles Waterman's Carib Queen, we find this statement that, apocryphal though it may be, I quite like. She says, there may be a revolution, according to him. A Black kingdom may take the place of the white one. King Henry and Queen Marie-Louise lived in the palace with their three remaining children. Tragically, their oldest son Ferdinand died in Paris in 1805. Their remaining children, Victor Henri, Améthyste, and Atenaire, this is a portrait of them. And I was so happy to learn that this portrait, which had been in a private collector's hands, was auctioned off and then was portrayed or on display, I should say, in the Haitian embassy in Washington, D.C., has recently returned home to Port-au-Prince, where it now hangs in its rightful spot, perhaps in Nupana Haitian Museum. So, when Henry created the kingdom, he also created this book of laws. And one of the most important things about this book of laws is that it was intended to get rid of the last vestiges of Frenchness, so to speak, which is interesting because the Code of Laws is, of course, going to be written in French. It will circulate all around the Atlantic world, translated into English, translated into Spanish. Foreign observers will say it is astonishing and remarkable. It contains the most moral association of men in existence, says Joseph Banks, the British naturalist. And what they were really commenting on was this system of affermage that Henri Christophe had instituted, which resembled sharecropping in a way, except that on these state-run farms, the cultivateurs, or the laborers, were supposed to share in some of the profits. They were supposed to get some of the profits. Now, Christophe's detractors said this never happened. They didn't, and this was a form of forced labor that stopped just short of slavery. But interestingly enough, because of these laws, Christophe is known as the legislator. So Dessalines was the warrior, Toussaint Louverture was the revolutionary, and Dessalines and Christophe was considered this remarkable legislator by commentators like Antoine Métral, for example, who very much admired King Henry and the kingdom. So I wanted to show you Christophe's coat of arms. So these are three different versions of it. So you see the commemorative coin issued by UNESCO, and you can read there very clearly, Je renais de mes cendres, so the phoenix, and I'm reborn from my ashes. The one in the middle is a facsimile from the Armorial of Haiti, which is in England in the Royal College of Arms, I believe. And so you see a color rendition of that facsimile there, which says, Dieu, ma cause et mon épée, God, my cause and my sword. And then you see the version here from the Gazette Royale d'Haïti that we find above every issue of this important newspaper from King Christophe's kingdom. I would not be able to leave you without talking about Christophe's most important minister, Baron de Hayti. And this is because Christophe was ardently anti-slavery and anti-color prejudice. His kingdom was known for capturing slave ships and confiscating the captive Africans of Spanish and Portuguese slave ships circulating in the waters around Haiti, releasing them into Haiti and allowing them to live there. But he also directed his most important ministers to write anti-slavery and anti-color prejudice pamphlets, which then circulated around the world. So not only were his laws circulating, his newspapers circulating, but these writings that were really kind of taking down the French colonists. This is one of Haty's works that was translated into English, and we see here, and published in London. I bring up this work in particular because I want to stress how it isn't the fact of Christophe being a king that puts him in a precarious position. It's the fact of Haiti's independence that puts both states of Haiti in a precarious position. A man named Thomas Strafford, who was a British man from Kingston, Jamaica, traveled to Haiti. He lived in the kingdom for a while, and when he traveled back to Kingston, he had a few copies of Baron de Haty's Réflexions sur une lettre de Mazères, the work I just showed you. He was found to be in possession of these documents, was arrested specifically because he had them, charged with inciting rebellion in Jamaica and attempting to spread seditious material around. And the sole evidence was that he had these documents on him. They went so far in the indictment, which is over 30 pages, to translate large chunks of that work of Baron de Haty's, which is actually the first translation of the work. And if you can see here, and I'd be happy to show these again if you're not able to look at it in this quick moment, but you can see that Strafford is not convicted ultimately of trying to incite rebellion. His defense is that that his Haitian housekeeper had inserted these documents into his suitcase, into his effects, and that he had no clue that they were there, and that he didn't know Christophe at all. But over here, we see an article from the Gazette Royale d'Haïti, and Thomas Strafford is clearly listed as an attendee at this dinner. He's actually mentioned multiple times in documents from the Kingdom of Haiti and in documents afterwards. So he had a very close relationship with Christophe, but nonetheless, that was his defense, and it spared him. He got off with a fine. He was still confined to prison for a few days and did have to submit a fine in order to be released. So I want to talk about the Citadel for a moment. So this is the famous Citadel I alluded to a moment ago. It was completed in 1813, and it was Henry's famous fortress that was designed to protect the country. Because while slavery is still happening all around the Atlantic world, so Haiti is basically surrounded by islands where slavery is still in effect, and North Atlantic, South Atlantic as well, continents. Henry builds multiple fortresses. He completes fortresses begun under Dessalines, as well as this Citadel. But the form of labor, again, that sort of labor that's not fully compensated, that's not quite slavery, is going to get him in trouble. And at least this is what his foreign observers will report soon after his death, by suicide in 1820. Tragically, Jean-Pierre Boyer kind of makes a strike at that little rebel region near Saint-Marc. A lot of Christophe's men go and join Boyer's side, and Christophe, who had suffered a stroke in August of 1820, decides to take his life on October 8th, 1820. This leads to the reunification of Haiti, the North and South, under one ruler, President Jean-Pierre Boyer, who will also eventually bring the Eastern side under his rule in 1822. But we know that disastrously, in 1825, Boyer agrees to pay an indemnity initially of 150 million francs to France as the price of recognition, later reduced in 1838 to 90 million francs, which virtually bankrupts the country and really kind of hamstrings future Haitian rulers and the Haitian people. So when I am asked, what is the takeaway from studying King Henry, I always say, King Henry was adamantly against paying any indemnity to France. And not only that, he directed his ministers to say, we're not even going to negotiate with you. We won't even talk about most favored nation status. We won't even talk about tariffs, favorable tariffs. We're not going to talk about any of it unless, as a a precondition you acknowledge Haitian independence. They threatened violence because of the violence that was threatened at them. And so this is from the Gazette Royale d'Haïti. Soon after, once again, the French had come under Louis XVIII to try to sort of see if they could regain control of the island. We read, because the French must come, let them come only once. The more who come, the more we will kill. And while we don't know what would have happened had King Henry lived, one thing I think, what we do know for sure is what happened without him. And I definitely think King Henry would still have persisted in not signing the indemnity. And one never knows what kind of Haiti we would have today if King Henry lived. So that to me is the takeaway for continuing to explore his life and legacy, his dreams and desires, as much as his flaws and mistakes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marlena, for that true tour de force. I hope we might be able to pick up on some of those points later on in conversation with Nicole. I'm going to move straight on for now, though, and if I could invite Tabitha to please unmute yourself and turn your camera on. I'm delighted to introduce Tabitha McIntosh, a literary scholar based in the UK, who works on the circulation of racializing objects and anecdotes in the Anglophone Atlantic. She's co-creator with Gregory Piero of an incredible online resource, the Kingdom of Objects, which is a website dedicated to publishing, translating, and understanding the play Neri, Chief of the Haitians, which was written in 1819 by Christophe's secretaries, Juste Chanlat. She's co-authored a fantastic article also with Gregory Piero on British images of Henri Christophe, and has also written on imaginary objects of the Haitian Revolution for the Age of Revolution's website. After Tabitha's presentation, I'm going to hand straight over to Nicole. So I'm going to thank you, Tabby, in advance, and hand straight over to you.
Well, I'm very excited to be here today. Not only am I a researcher, I'm also an English teacher in a London high school, Noah Hill High School, and it is Black History Month for us as it is everywhere in the UK, so never been a better time to talk about the intertwined nature of Haitian and British history, which is not talked about enough. I'm also a weirdly unstable type 1 diabetic, so the presentation I'm giving you, I've pre-recorded just in case my blood sugar collapses. So let me have a go on that for you. 1 second. I'm talking today about the lives and afterlives of the objects from which Christophe assembled the Kingdom of Haiti, what I'm calling the Kingdom of Objects. As Troyo suggests, these objects are the material from which our cultural memories of the kingdom are constructed. They are now lost and stolen and strayed, but most of all, they're composed of imagination. Why did the nation need to be staged and performed? Because the world refused to recognize the existence of Haiti. Immense importance was therefore accorded to every interaction between the island nation and the rest of the Atlantic powers. Being recognized meant being recognizable, and the necessity of minute attention to the performance of nationhood, to material details of rank and file, is attested to by British naval reports on Haitian officers. This one, for example, is sent from an officer on HMS Hyperion in 1810, and notice that it appears in newspapers across the British Isles. There is intense public interest in these visual appraisals of the legitimacy of the Haitian state. We have an assessment of the quite literal material of the nation, the nature of the buttons, the red edging, dimity cloth, and Frenchified affect. The phrasing of that last line is crucial. He appeared a character born to command. Natural authority, being born to command, required meticulously costumed performance, appearance as the correct kind of character on the international stage. And Christophe is learning from these early encounters. In 1811, he's crowned king and adopts a European-style monarchy, specifically British in performed style. That performance requires very specific material trappings, and they appear 4 months later. In the autumn of 1811, two things hit the British presses simultaneously. The first one is reported as curiosity and quickly disappears, but it speaks directly to the uniform analysis conducted in this letter from the Hyperion. Here we have Samuel Richardson suing Gabriel Peltier for defamation. Both men purport to be acting in the service of the Haitian king. Note how Richardson describes himself in court. as both a supercargo and an agent, a diplomat. In these split capacities, Richardson delivered a series of entirely ineffectual demands for state recognition, while simultaneously engaging the firm Batty and Pilgrim, eminent merchants in this country, to provide £15,000 worth of military uniforms. In the most explicit way possible, the execution of this commission purchase was intended both as an overture of diplomacy and an assemblage of statecraft. Richardson's task was to procure the recognition of Haiti while at the same time procuring the material that would make Haiti recognizable as a nation. The second incident went early 19th century viral. On October 29, 1811, a vessel containing kingly regalia and coronation goods destined for the King of Haiti was seized by customs house officers in London. Having crowned himself king, Henry was assembling the objects with which kingship was staged, a sceptre and a sword of state. It's hard to overstate how much interest this seized shipment occasioned, or how much fervent speculation was prompted about the impossible nature of the man for whom such impossible objects were designed. The sword line is, however, a good indicator, a grand idea of the muscular power of the emperor. Notice here that there's no crown mentioned, as indeed the Caledonian Mercury confirms on the 7th of November. Also the Caledonian Mercury 3 weeks later. The crown is to be released and is worth 7,000 guineas. As you'll see, fluctuations in both the value and basic existence of the King of Haiti's objects is a theme in European writing. End of December 1811. British fascination with this seized shipment has only increased. Now presses across Britain are enumerating the contents of the cargo in breathless lists like this one. And count the crowns. We've gone from no crowns to 1 to 2 plus 7 tiaras. Henry's crowned heads were multiplying as fast as the English could imagine them. And that was it for a while. The stagecraft of state was duly shipped to Haiti. Interest died down. We have in general ceased to concern ourselves about the Haitians, said the editors of the Evening Mail in September 1814. But in October things changed. The Haitian Parliament made public evidence of French schemes to try and recover its former colony in the form of letters carried by French agents captured on the island. In the ensuing uproar, the nation mobilised for an expected French invasion, and Henry reached out to Great Britain. Pamphlets were written, broadsides circulated, and William Wilberforce's approach to champion the kingdom's rebuff of France. But rather crucially, these overtures and arguments came with an entirely different public relations strategy, one designed to capture the British press imagination in the same way the seized coronation goods had, but this time quite deliberately. The king commissions luxury goods, and not just any luxury goods, the most luxurious luxury goods that ever luxuriated. Within weeks, the goods are designed and manufactured and ready to be shipped, as shown in this Times story. But why does the Times know about all of this? Because the craftsmen display their magnificent creations and the public lines up to look at them. Not for free either. The showcase luxury goods are performances where Henry and his kingdom are staged for a paying audience. Look at who's been chosen to create these performances. The suppliers to the British royal family, Rundle Bridge and Rundle themselves. This one is an article about the state carriage designed by the firm Crowther and Tapp, just to give you a sense of the column space devoted to describing Haitian royal goods. It was reprinted across the nation. And remember that coach, because it's coming back soon. No more Frenchified costumes or characters. The Hanovers were being challenged on their own ostentatious terms, using objects and articles created by their own artists. The final visual material coup were the portraits of the King and Crown Prince of Haiti, commissioned by Henry and executed by an English artist, Richard Evans, exhibited in the Royal Academy in 1818. As the dismissive and openly racist comment there suggests, being a king required looking like a king to the British eye. Mission accomplished. That's actually a British naval uniform that he's wearing. And another change. 2.5 years later, the kingdom and its king collapse. His troops took the palace apart looking for objects to sell to the European and American merchants waiting in port, and many of those merchants didn't wait to have plunder delivered to them, but instead took matters into their own hands. Here we have a fairly typically grotesque story about a merchant who'd arrived in Cap Henry with goods to deliver, only to find that the buyer was dead and the goods unwanted. So he took what he could. He went to Sans Souci, pocketed fragments of the shattered chandeliers made by Bolton's Soho foundry, and prized up floorboards drenched with the king's blood. I did call the museum. They deny having any of this. By January 1821, the Kingdom of Objects, was arriving in coastal towns across the Atlantic, their arrival announced in confused and often contradictory portside gossip. In Philadelphia, Boston, and Baltimore, news spread that the King's crown had been sold to one lucky US captain for a mere $12. Sometimes it had been made in Philadelphia, this crown, and cost the improbable sum of $70,000. Both the story and the crown failed to materialise, but other things did. Here we have Captain Condry, who had elsewhere published a long and very sensitive account of the kingdom, arriving in Newburyport with an official portrait of the Queen that he seems to have taken while having a tour of the kingdom. He claims vaguely to be offering it to science, as you can see here, but science has no record of receiving it. And by the end of 1821, crucial elements of the theatre of the kingdom had been shipped to the United States and could be viewed daily for a mere 12.5 cents. This £600 bronze of the royal arms came complete with an imaginary price tag of $2,500 and was displayed with an oil portrait of the king, which is almost certainly this German one that appeared and then disappeared in an online auction in Germany a few years ago. The black market for black history is still very much alive. And goods designed by British artisans came home and continued speaking about their intended owner. Sometimes, as with these carriage trimmings, they were republicised and redisplayed, more money made from them. Sometimes, as with this single plate from the King's commissioned Spode set, they were put on display in museums, of geology in this instance. Plates from this set continue to surface in unregulated online auctions, including eBay, where I saw one for sale last year. Which takes us to the final act, an improbable melodrama about that state coach designed by Mr. Crowther in 1815 and publicised across Britain and the Atlantic presses. Remember that? While we have the extensive descriptions of its every shiny facet, the coaches themselves are long gone. In style and execution, they were designed to resemble the great state coaches of Britain. This gold monstrosity has been used by the British royal family since 1762. And this equally tasteful number has been used by the Lord Mayor of the City of London since 1758. I'm dwelling here on their unspeakable tastelessness, their hyperbolic performance of gaudy luxury, because that is the aspect that will become crucial in the afterlives of Crowther's coaches too. They were a disaster. This 1816 commentary from slavery apologist and all-round bad guy Joseph Marriott does a good job of summarising the story laid out in the court transcripts of Crowther's bankruptcy trial, which would shortly follow. The king hated the coaches. He agreed to take them, but instead insisted that payment would only be made in sugar and coffee, and, rather crucially, he priced those according to Haiti's own estimation of the current value of commodities. And here are the court receipts. Held, like much ephemera from the Kingdom of Haiti, at Boston Public Library. They were donated by a light-fingered American merchant on the island who acquired a great deal of the matter of Haiti. From its first display in London to its disastrous delivery in Cap Henry, the Crowther State Coach was an object perfectly designed for the delivery of meaning. At first, it spoke to Henry's equal status with his British peers. And then it spoke to the hubris of one man, Mr. Crowther, tasty slice of schadenfreude. But almost immediately it was made to speak for the relative merits of Haiti and Britain themselves. This 1819 essay from the Quarterly Review was reprinted widely and is worth pausing on. The Kingdom of Haiti is making its own carriages. 3 gaudy ones purchased for him in England gave him offence, and he asked if the English considered him as a king of Congo. As is characteristic of stories about Henry, this quote is unattributed and highly improbable. It speaks rather to contemporary perceptions of race and nation, and it does so by forcing attention to the British ruling elite. If such a carriage is suitable only for a king of Congo, a caricatured savage drawn to shiny objects and incapable of elegance, What does that say about the King of England himself? And here, on a similar line, we have an eyewitness account of the use and display of carriages, written by a British naval officer visiting Sans-Souci while Henry was still alive, not published until after his death. The English-built carriages don't rate a description. They're just next to the real deal. The Haitian carriages, tasteful, elegant, ornamented wherever possible with silver or, even better, iron. Gold, it seems, is for the tacky, spendthrift Hanovers. By 1828, the story of the ridiculous coaches is turning into an anecdote. Details are gestured at, and it's really used only for a punchline. And the English, as embodied in the grasping Mr. Crowther, are still the punchline, very much a punchline. Crowther, we imagine, thinks that Sans-Souci is paved with silver and walled with gold. Into this imaginary Arabian Nights confection he brings his on-spec carriages and then is undone by wily Henry. And that's where the story of this object, the story of all of Henry's objects and the story of Henry himself, takes a turn. Here's an early version by Gaspard, the French consul in the Republic of Haiti until the early 1830s. This new drama is that of Tyrant Henry, a man who regularly murders his subjects in the service of his greed, and whose greed couldn't be slaked only by manufacturing state coaches. Give me a coach like George III's, or give me death. Your death, of course. Henry shouting at his carriage builders is an anecdote that will recur. But, in the meantime, this happens. The tasteless Crowther coaches, rejected by Henry, stored unused at Sans-Souci, the butt of a joke about how tasteless British people are, gets reversed. Now the gold state coaches are used to speak to grave flaws in both Henry's individual character and in the characters of all black people. The finery, the splendid baubles, must have struck Henry's subjects with astonishment. And as a side note, notice how very close that is to what Carpentier says in The Kingdom of This World about how staggered he was to picture a black royal court in Haiti, so much so that he was forced to invent magical realism on the spot. The mere mouldering existence of these coaches is sufficient to render the name of king, and the name of this king in particular, odious. Here is an 1865 iteration of Henry and the Coach Builder story. By now it's explicitly flagging itself as an anecdote. The following anecdote told by a man in a position to be well informed, because we're still just in range of having people with living memory. The Crowther coaches have presumably moulded away by 1865, but the story of their arrival continues to accrue layers, and they're not nice layers. Here is the shape those layers have settled into by the time the 19th century tips into the 20th, and US journalists have begun the groundwork of American imperial expansion. If Henry wanted a carriage built, he went about it in a way that should by now be familiar, but with a new and exciting twist. If it is not here before me, finished and perfect in every particular, in 2 weeks you will be thrown over the precipice. And in such matters, Christophe never broke his word. This Fanny B. Ward, the journalist responsible for this story and many stories about the kingdom, is the first person to commit to type the idea that Henry killed himself with a silver bullet, an imaginary object that would become omnipresent for the entire rest of the 20th century. And now, while we tremble on the precipice, the story of Crowther's coach and of Henry's kingdom of speaking objects takes another turn. Evidence of its existence as a Haitian folk tale emerges in print. In this tale, and it's a tale so good that it deserves to be true, the coach becomes a defiant gesture of national pride. Henry's challenge to the White Atlantic, to the kings and queens of Europe, is embodied in his response to its arrival. An envoy from the King of England brings gifts and diplomatic overtures. Included in these gifts is a magnificent state carriage. And what does Henry do? He sets his craftsmen to work. And when the envoy from the King of England sails back across the Atlantic, he takes with him a royal carriage copied from the British gift, but even more extravagantly carved and gilded. Anything you can do, we can do better. And I love the author's important note at the end of this. The accuracy of such tales of Christophe's reign cannot be determined. And here it is again, as recently as 2013. It's folktale and fairy tale both. The Queen of England offers Henry a coach. In response, he tells his artisans to create one in Sans Souci. He will send it to England so it can tell the Queen that the Kingdom of Haiti is not just as good as her sovereign state, but better. And he did. He had it built. So to restate, the accuracy of such tales of Christophe's reign cannot be determined. The true value and material composition of his commissioned tiaras and confiscated sceptres and rejected coaches and intimidatingly large swords cannot be determined. Almost all of it is lost or stolen. But the stories these objects told and continue to tell, they can be accurately assessed. I'll end by returning to Troyo. The things from which his memory of Christophe were made include that carriage, a lost carriage, an abandoned carriage, an ultimately imaginary carriage into which the desires and fears of the Atlantic could be poured and still are being poured. So I just wanted to end by showing you the kind of things you can buy on eBay. So this is a coin with Henry's stamp on it. This one's one of the buttons made for him that ended up being sold in an unregulated way. They're picked up by detectorists and then sold in utterly unregulated. Cameron Monroe has told me off before for buying important artifacts on eBay, but somebody has to buy them and then put them somewhere proper. And yeah, that's it from me.
Hello, everyone. I wonder if you can see me. I hope that you can see me. Thank you both very much to Tabitha and Marlena for those wonderful presentations. And thank you to Esther for that earlier wonderful introduction. And thank you very much for your birthday wishes. I'm very graciously sharing my birthday party this year with Henri Christophe. And I'm, of course, very grateful to have the opportunity to do so as well. I'm Dr. Nicole Wilson, and I'm a Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellow at the University of Central Lancashire. And I'd like to just take this opportunity now to invite both Marlena and Tabitha to jump back on very quickly so I can ask them both a few questions about their wonderful talks. So I'll wait for you to enter back into the room. Hi, Tabitha.
Hi.
And is Marlena joining us as well? Yes, wonderful. Okay, so those are really, really great presentations and such lovely visuals and descriptive narrative accounts as well of Henri Christophe's kingdom and the revolutionary period, which kind of anticipated it all as well. I'm conscious that we're very pressed for time, so I'll keep the questions very brief. One thing that I thought that was really wonderful and tied both of your presentations together beautifully was this idea that that Christophe created this proud Haitian, distinctively Haitian legacy. Marlena, you talked about the citadel, which is this wonderful, imposing structure, and you know is now designated UNESCO World Heritage Site. And also looked at some of those images from the kingdom, like the coat of arms. And I love how you presented some of those news accounts, Tabitha, where Henri Christophe is casting himself as this person born to command, and you know he's kind of circulating and propagating, actively propagating this image of himself across the world. So I wonder if you could both perhaps briefly speak to how we might see him as a kind of icon of Black nationalism and perhaps Black internationalism. I realise that might be quite a big question, but whoever would like to kick us off first, perhaps Marlena?
Icon of Black nationalism or internationalism. I mean, I think that I think probably Dessalines is a more appropriate figure to think about Black internationalism because of course, as we know, the famous article in Dessalines' Constitution designating all Haitians as Black. And the interesting thing is that one really interesting thing, there's so many interesting things, is that under Dessalines, they would publish accounts of people who immigrated to Haiti from like Denmark or England and Sweden and renounced their citizenship to become Haiti, thereby also becoming Black. So just kind of thinking about Blackness as a global signifier to me makes me think more of Dessalines than Christophe. Christophe is, you know, he was definitely saw himself and wanted to be a part of a Black elite, which is not to say that elitism and royalty is contra Black internationalism, but simply that I would have to think a little bit more about it. I think certainly certain documents that came out of the Christophe era, written by his ministers, written in the newspapers, definitely speak to the idea that combating slavery and color prejudice is a global problem, and that Haitians are well poised to take that on. So I would say that kind of en gros in Haiti, yes, but Christophe himself is a kind of, I think, a difficult figure to see without great nuance in terms of the traditional frame of Black internationalism.
I mean, I think but one of the interesting things about Christophe is considering him in relationship to Great Britain. Obviously, we look at how he's using, you know, inflections of British kingship, British art. But as I wrote with Greg Pirot, and as a lot of people are working on, that alters depending on who he's talking to, who he's thinking about, how he's performing his own state, which in many ways remains quite unknowable. But there's interesting stuff about what's going on inside the palace and how it's been constructed of all kinds of Caribbean and West African touch points, as well as French ones, as well as English ones. But when he's talking to the English, he could not be more English. When he's doing his own art inside the palace, it's also French inflected. When he's suddenly working with German artists, then he could not be more German. You know, so in that sense, he's aware of himself and of Blackness, and of himself as a representative of Blackness, as a sort of traveling international signifier that is read upon, and he plays with that extremely well.
That's really great, and really interesting to hear both of your responses to that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about Christophe in the context of wider Haitian history, of what comes before and what comes after. And that's really, really fascinating. So I know that Esther gave a really wonderful introduction to the things that you're doing and the things that you've done, the resources that you've built, but I wonder if you'd both just like to take the opportunity to explain in your own terms what people can find on your website, how they can use these resources, and yeah, what's there. So Marlena, again, if you'd like to kick us off, followed by Tabitha.
Sure. So the Gazette Royale project was really designed to kind of collect in one place and transcribe and make searchable the two different newspapers that I showed during the presentation, the Gazette Royale de l'État d'Haïti, and then after that, the Gazette Royale d'Haïti. And so really, if you want to know the nitty gritty of how the kingdom wanted to present itself, what they talked about internally, but also, as I always stress, how they saw the world, a lot of the newspapers, especially during the statehood days rather than the kingdom days, are about what's happening in the world, because of course the Napoleonic Wars are happening. These are momentous events that deeply concern Haitians. They're very concerned anytime England and France go to war, which is a lot, as you all know, during this time period, back and forth with treaties of peace. They're concerned with Napoleon taking over Italy. They're concerned when he goes into Russia. These are things they want to know about. And so if you're interested in knowing what Haitians thought about the world, not just how they presented themselves, but their perspectives, then I think these papers are just invaluable. And I've learned so much from reading them. And one of my favorite issues is when they find out that Napoleon has escaped from the island of Elba and returned to Paris. I highly recommend reading their astonishment and dragging of Parisians for allowing this to happen.
Marlene's projects are encyclopedic and amazing. My project with Greg Pirot is very, very focused. It's one specific text that we managed to trace the sort of provenance of. So something that was looted or sold or stolen, otherwise ended up in Paris, and then was just not catalogued. It was catalogued, it was miscatalogued for 200 years. So it's one of those you know, I found it in the archives. I didn't find it at all. It was sitting right there, having been archived. But like so much of the kingdom, it's just scattered and then misfiled as fictional or completely wrong. So we've uploaded it, it's translated, and then we've got a lot of paratextual history surrounding it about the history of this particular material object, what that says about the way Black history, but specifically Haitian history, is collected around the Atlantic. And it's really fun because it's also, well, it's odd. It's a play about the Haitian Revolution, about great victory, except it's not. It's completely false history. It's really fascinating. Do go look, read.
Excellent. Well, thank you both, and thank you for sharing your insights about those wonderful resources. They are really fantastic resources, and I've used them profusely, and I'm sure other people knowing about them will encourage them to use them as well. So I hope that you will both enjoy the rest of the show and the closing performance that we have lined up. So you can now kick back and relax and both mute yourselves and turn off your video. I'm sure that this has been really insightful for everyone listening at home, and especially those more unfamiliar with the revolutionary and post-revolutionary history of Haiti. It's especially fascinating to hear about the Kingdom of Haiti's relationship, both cultural and diplomatic, with Great Britain. Certainly in the wake of recent debates around colonial histories and how nations begin to reckon with their own colonial legacies. It seems important to understand quite how crucial Haiti was at that time to Atlantic world debates. We can see how its revolutionary, anti-colonial and anti-slavery struggle shaped emerging thoughts about liberty and equality, and how its emerging national projects, including its experiments in monarchy, informed what was happening in Britain and elsewhere in the North Atlantic world. These conversations form a natural springboard for my own talk on dress and court fashions in the Kingdom of Haiti. So I'm now going to share my screen with you. Okay. So my interest in dress, beyond a sensory and aesthetic predilection for nice things, springs from a larger interest in material culture and material histories. Objects and things, just like texts and images, are imbued with meaning and inscribed with the testimony of makers, users, and ancestors. Unlike written documents or other archival sources that were authored by colonial bystanders, however, material culture allows us to get closer to the lived experiences of those whom literacy was so often denied. And this encompassed the vast majority of enslaved and free people of colour living in slave-holding societies. Additionally, because roles associated with the care, manufacture and sale of textiles were commonly taken on by enslaved and free women of colour, these artefacts offer up unique insights about those women. Material culture is also central to the saga of the Haitian Revolution and the stories that circulated in its advent throughout the Atlantic world. However, these stories, immortalized in textual narratives and visual artworks, were authored almost exclusively by elite white male colonial observers, and often fueled highly racialized and demeaning stereotypes about the presumed decadence and immodesty of women of color. This painting, produced around 1780 by Agostino Brunias, depicting a linen market scene in the colony of Dominica, brings some of these negative stereotypes to the foreground. These types of images, which were commonly circulated in the period, are characteristically unrepresentative of the narratives that women of colour, through fashion and textiles, strove to create for themselves. The moment that Haiti, as an independent post-revolutionary nation state, begins to forge its own sovereign narratives through various cultural endeavours, nevertheless represents a point of rupture. though misogynistic and racialized stereotypes continued to circulate in various forms across the Atlantic in the wake of the Haitian Revolution, and arguably became more prolific and exaggerated, the cultural output of independent Haiti represented a concerted effort to reclaim its material history and affirm more positive and uplifting narratives, as we have already heard from Tabitha's work. This was especially true of Christophe's Haitian kingdom, which aspired to cultivate a narrative of gentility and refinement through its material cultural endeavours. Material narratives from Christophe's court also offer rich insights into the often overlooked and frequently marginalised stories of important women, especially of his wife, Queen Marie-Louise, and his daughters, the princesses Françoise Amétis and Anne Etenaïa. Notices published in the British press, for example, frequently alluded to the British clothing commissions of Queen Marie-Louise and the princesses. One such account, published in the Morning Chronicle in October 1815 and reproduced in the Ladies' Monthly Museum, describes a series of very superb dresses that had just at that moment been completed for the Christophe women by a fashionable English dressmaker. The dresses are described in minute detail, as you can see here. The Queen's dress is described as consisting of a petticoat of white satin, richly embroidered in gold sunflowers, terminating at the bottom with a broad gold fringe, with a train of white satin, embroidered like the petticoat, looped up on each side to form a drapery, with gold tassels and bullion. We also learn that it's finished with a beautiful gold net held up by large cords of bullion over the shoulder, and a rich plume of white feathers for the hair. In absence of known portraits which capture the splendour of such court robes, descriptions of clothing commissions allow us to piece together the jigsaw of these women's scattered lives and tell us a great deal about the tastes of the first women within the Royal Haitian Court. Furthermore, by looking at these publicised descriptions alongside similar dresses from the period, and also at fashion plates reflecting styles unique to certain fashionable English dressmakers from the 1810s, we can imaginatively reconstruct historical artefacts that have since been lost or destroyed. The fashion plate on the left is taken from an issue of the Ladies' English fashion magazine La Belle Assemblée in 1815, the same year that the court dresses were completed. It depicts a costume produced by a Mrs. Mary Ann Bell, who was the daughter-in-law of the publisher, but also one of the most prominent London dressmakers of the period, who we know took on other court commissions for members of the English royal family. So it's very possible that Mary Ann Bell could have produced these dresses. It visualises many of the elements of Marie-Louise's costume, and also the costumes of the daughters, including the gold embroidery, tassels, fringe, blonde lace, and plumes of feathers. Surviving period-appropriate costumes with comparable elements add another colourful dimension to this imagined reconstruction. The image on the right is a photograph of a court dress that belonged to Cornelia Johanna van Nellestein of Utrecht, dated between 1808 and 1812, and held by the Rijksmuseum in the Netherlands. In particular, I'd like to draw attention to the train of this dress, which is embroidered with gold sunflowers, very much like Marie-Louise's aforementioned dress. While there's no visual record of these costumes in the form of artistic portraits, a surviving portrait depicting the princesses alongside their brother, the Crown Prince, Jacques Victor, was recovered several years ago, and we've heard quite a bit about this portrait already, and we used it in the marketing for this event tonight. And it offers a rare glimpse of the everyday styles adopted by women in the royal court. However, it's clear by looking at this image that the spotlight is very much on Jacques Victor, who dominates the frame. Our attention is drawn to his military double-breasted frock coat and his medal with the emblem of a phoenix rising from the ashes, which, as we already know from Marlena's talk, was a widely used motif in the Kingdom of Christophe. By comparison, the princesses, who are partially eclipsed by his imposing figure, are somewhat muted in their elegant yet quite plain muslin day dresses with only slight accents of colour. These dresses bear no resemblance to the richly decorated court dresses with gold and silver elements, detailed floral embroidery, and composed of multiple expensive fabrics like satin and lace that were completed by the unnamed English dressmaker in 1815. Any portraits of the Christophe women in their full sartorial splendour were pillaged, displaced, or destroyed in the wake of the kingdom's fall. 1 year after Christophe's death, Marie-Louise and her daughters found themselves in England, where they made a home for themselves over the next few years. Hosted upon their arrival by the abolitionist Thomas Clarkson at his home at Playford Hall in Suffolk, they subsequently rented independent accommodations at Blackheath, Hastings, and Marylebone. Though it seems that they lived a rather secluded existence in exile, a published account of items auctioned from their Marylebone townhouse upon their departure for Europe in 1824 shows that they continued to surround themselves with modern, fashionable commodities. Though this story might sound like one of elite privilege, it is also one of defiant subversion, reflecting the courage, intrepidity, and ingenuity of a Black queen in the age of slavery, and a determination by her and her daughters to endure beyond the limited life cycle of the Haitian kingdom. Whatever the fate of the material histories of Haiti, they continued to carve out new material legacies in Britain and beyond.
Thank you so much, Nicole. It's so interesting, and I think for reasons of time, we're going to need to move on, but I just want to say how much we are looking forward in the coming years and months to learning more from you about Marie-Louise's material culture, but also especially her time in exile in Britain and then subsequently in Italy. I also want to mention your amazing website, Femmes Rebelles, meaning rebel women in Haitian Creole, which is devoted, for those of you who don't know it, to uncovering stories of women in the Haitian Revolution. So please do check that out. Another wonderful new resource being put together by this fantastically energetic and vibrant community of Haitian studies scholars. So thank you again, Nicole. I now have the great honor of introducing Joseph Gardy-Lessard, who has prepared a presentation for us on the subject of the coins and medals of the State and Kingdom of Haiti. A lawyer by profession, Joseph Lessard is a great champion of Haitian history. And as president of the Haitian Numismatic Society, he's the foremost expert in Haitian numismatics. Joseph is going to speak in French, but English translations are going to kick in the second slide. Thank you so much for giving up your time for this event, Joseph, and just thrilled that you could be part of it. So Layla, could you please share the presentation for us? Thank you. Perhaps while we're waiting for that to happen, I could quickly just ask Nicole to say a little bit more about her, about Marie-Louise in exile in Britain.
Absolutely, I'm very happy to talk about Marie-Louise, Esther. As you know, I could talk about Marie-Louise all day. And in fact, as Michelet mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I've been working recently with the Haitian Chamber of Commerce to produce a short amateur documentary. So people can learn lots more about her exile journey in that documentary, which will be connected to the website and which I will share information about on the website and via Twitter very soon once that's finished. And I think we might be ready to go now. So I will just jump off again.
Je tiens, avant de commencer, à remercier les organisateurs de cet événement qui m'ont donné l'occasion de parler des monnaies et médailles de l'État d'Haïti et du Royaume d'Haïti à l'occasion du bicentenaire de la mort de Henri Ier. Et je remercie également Nicole Wilson de m'y avoir associé. L'histoire commence le 1er janvier 1804. Après 15 années de guerre, d'anciens esclaves mus par les idéaux de la Révolution française proclament l'indépendance de Saint-Domingue sous le nom d'Haïti. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, sous les ordres de qui les révoltés avaient obtenu la capitulation des troupes françaises, est choisi pour diriger les destinées de ce nouvel État qui émerge sur la scène internationale. Immédiatement après la cérémonie, tous les défis inhérents à l'établissement et au fonctionnement d'une nation s'imposent aux dirigeants. L'irritante et permanente question du partage des richesses aboutissent le 17 octobre 1806 à l'assassinat du général Dessalines, devenu depuis le 22 septembre 1804 empereur sous le nom de Jacques Ier. Christophe, général en chef de l'armée, est tout indiqué pour assurer la succession. Pourtant, celui dont l'œuvre marquera d'une pierre blanche l'histoire d'Haïti n'est pas un natif de Saint-Domingue. Il est né le 16 octobre 1867 à la Grenade. Il est conduit très jeune au Cap français par un armateur français. À 12 ans, il est engagé pour porter secours aux insurgés américains contre les Anglais. À son retour, il entreprend plusieurs métiers. Il est maître boucher au Cap et s'adonne également au commerce d'animaux sauvages. Il devient inspecteur des cultures sous les ordres de Toussaint Louverture et propriétaire de plusieurs habitations qu'il cultive. Il se retrouve employé à l'hôtel La Couronne, dont il en fera l'acquisition. En 1793, au moment où la bourrasque de la révolte commence à souffler sur Saint-Domingue, il secoue son tablier d'aubergiste et entre dans l'armée. Au moment de prendre son service, il épouse Marie-Louise Courtauld, avec qui il aura 4 enfants. François Ferdinand, Françoise Améthyste, Anne Athénaïse et Jacques Victor. Eugène, duc du Maule, n'était pas le fils de Marie-Louise, soit dit en passant, puisqu'il va choisir le 18 octobre 1820 de lier sa destinée à celle de Jacques Victor, puisqu'ils seront fusillés ensemble comme étant les fils du roi. 2 février 1802, il affronte l'escadre française conduite par le général Leclerc en vue de rétablir l'esclavage. Réponse aux menaces de l'émissaire français lui faisant injonction de remettre la ville, sinon il y débarquera 15 000 hommes, Christophe répond « Si vous avez la force dont vous me menacez, je vous prêterai toute la résistance qui caractérise un général, et si le sort des armes vous est favorable, vous n'entrerez dans la ville du Cap que lorsqu'elle sera réduite en cendres, et même sur ces cendres, je vous combattrai encore. » Christophe n'est pas homme à se laisser intimider. À la première alerte, il donne le signal en incendiant sa propre demeure. Après la déportation de Toussaint Louverture, il se soumet au capitaine général Leclerc à l'instar des autres généraux indigènes. À la reprise des combats, il se range du côté des insurgés sous les ordres de Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Ses prouesses lui valent d'être signataire de l'acte de l'indépendance. Dessalines est assassiné le 17 octobre 1806. Ce n'est que le 23 octobre qu'il fait savoir aux généraux des 3 autres divisions militaires qu'il accepte le poste de chef provisoire du gouvernement haïtien, mais ordonne la tenue d'une assemblée devant procéder à la rédaction d'une nouvelle constitution. Il désapprouve cependant l'orientation des travaux et décide le 18 décembre 1806 de marcher sur Port-au-Prince en dépit de sa nomination comme président d'Haïti. Son armée campe à Sibert, à l'entrée nord de Port-au-Prince, et fait face à la résistance des troupes de l'Ouest. Pris de colère, il reprend le chemin de son fief et déclare le département du Nord indépendant. Il fonde le 17 février 1807 l'État d'Haïti. L'événement est mémorisé par la frappe d'une médaille dont le revers proclame « La lumière a éclaté sur nous et une constitution bienfaisante a mis fin aux complots et machinations desquels nous étions sur le point de devenir les victimes. Un code nouveau, adapté pour nos manières, notre climat et nos coutumes est sorti, comme pour ainsi dire, du chaos et a fixé la destinée de Haïti. » Mieux que ses adversaires du Sud, Christophe organise très vite son gouvernement et met en place une ossature administrative. Il regroupe autour de lui les anciens partisans et collaborateurs de Dessalines. La scission n'est pas seulement territoriale ou simplement politique, elle est surtout l'expression complexe des rivalités entre Noirs et mulâtres. Pour parer aux inconvénients hérités du système monétaire colonial et marquer la souveraineté de cette fraction du territoire, Christophe ordonne le 2 septembre 1807, par un arrêté paru dans la Gazette officielle de l'État d'Haïti du 10 septembre, la frappe de la première monnaie haïtienne. Il s'agit d'une première série de 3 pièces en argent de 7 sols 6 deniers, 15 sols, 30 sols, présentant les caractéristiques suivantes. Ceci est un agrandissement de la pièce de 7 sols 6 deniers. Ce n'est pas la taille exacte, mais elle permet de découvrir son caractère rudimentaire puisqu'elle a été fabriquée au Cap avec les moyens du bord à partir des anciennes monnaies coloniales. Haïti ne disposait pas, comme jusqu'à présent d'ailleurs, pas de ressources lui permettant de frapper une monnaie esthétiquement semblable à ce qui se faisait ailleurs. L'avers présente la liberté sous les apparences d'une femme portant une longue robe ample dont le sein droit n'est pas couvert, en signe d'abondance et de générosité. Elle tient dans une main le faisceau du licteur et dans l'autre une pique surmontée du bonnet phrygien. Cette représentation s'inspire sans doute de la symbolique révolutionnaire française, comme d'ailleurs le montre cette allégorie de la liberté faite au moment de la prise de la Bastille. Au revers est inscrit Libertas Religio Mores, qui sont la devise de l'État d'Haïti, et dans le champ, les lettres HC, entrelacées dans un écu surmonté d'une couronne. D'aucuns pensent que c'est déjà un signe prémonitoire de l'ambition de Christophe à devenir roi. Signalons au passage que celle de 30 sols constitue l'une des plus grandes raretés de la numismatique haïtienne. L'expérience n'est pas du goût de Henri Christophe. Il charge alors son agent commercial à Londres, Jean-Gabriel Pelletier, de s'en occuper. Celui-ci s'adresse le 25 janvier 1808 à Matthew Boulton de la monnaie de Soho à Birmingham pour lui faire part du désir de son commettant. Il communique à cet effet les spécifications exigées. Les dénominations sont similaires à celles qui ont été préalablement frappées. Retenons rapidement que Toussaint Louverture, arrivé à Saint-Domingue en 1801, avait fixé la valeur de la gourde espagnole dans les deux parties de l'île à 11 escalins. C'est cette même structure qui est conservée. En 1807, la gourde vaut encore 11 escalins. Les propositions de même inspiration que la médaille de 1807 sont faites, mais ne seront pas frappées. Une nouvelle série de 3 pièces sera alors réalisée. L'allégorie de la liberté est désormais assise. La symbolique ressemble étrangement à celle de l'Angleterre avec Britannia. Le revers, en revanche, présente les mêmes symboles que les précédentes pièces. Le 26 mars 1811, la ville de Ouanamet est parcourue par une nombreuse cavalcade au cri de « Vive le roi, vive la reine ». La première monarchie du Nouveau Monde venait de naître. Une nouvelle constitution est adoptée et Henri Christophe devient, le 2 juin 1811, roi d'Haïti sous le nom de Henri Ier. L'événement est mémorisé par la frappe d'une nouvelle monnaie agréablement ciselée dans les formes et dans l'esthétique gréco-romaine. Cette série présente le nouveau monarque drapé, cuirassé et la tête laurée. Il faut quand même distinguer dans cette série 2 types dont un présente le monarque avec l'oreille couverte par les cheveux et la couronne de laurier, et le second dont l'oreille est découverte. Pour la dernière année de son règne, Christophe honore sa femme en portant ses initiales ML, vous avez deviné qu'il s'agit de Marie-Louise, au revers de la pièce de 1820. À partir de 1814, une nouvelle série d'essais sont connus dont la taille permet d'établir la dénomination. Il s'agit des pièces de 1/4 de gourde, d'une demi-gourde et d'une gourde. Les essais sont aussi connus pour une monnaie de plus petite dénomination. Ce sont des pièces de 1 escalin un quart de gourde ou un gourdin, d'une demi-gourde ou un gourdin. Nous allons maintenant présenter les insignes de l'ordre royal et militaire de Saint-Henri. Préalablement à son sacre, Henri Christophe fonde le 30 avril 1811 l'ordre royal et militaire de Saint-Henri. La distinction se compose du roi, en qualité de chef souverain, grand maître et fondateur, du prince royal et autres fils du roi, de 16 grands croix, 32 commandeurs et autant de chevaliers que Sa Majesté jugera à propos de nommer. Il s'agit d'un ordre religieux chrétien dédié à la protection armée de la religion catholique qui est celle du royaume. Voici l'insigne du grand collier qui d'ailleurs apparaît sur les armoiries du roi. Celui-ci représente la croix en broderie d'or avec à côté un très beau portrait de Henri Christophe réalisé par un peintre allemand au Cap Henri. Voici l'insigne du Grand Croix placé sur un ruban noir moiré et d'une très belle facture. Celui-ci est l'insigne du commandeur. Enfin, celui du chevalier. Toute cette magnificence s'achève le 15 août 1820 en l'église de Limonade où Henri Christophe est frappé d'apoplexie. Désormais, le royaume est dirigé par les ministres sous la présidence du prince Victor-Henri. Il n'est âgé que de 16 ans. Le signal de la révolte est donné à Saint-Marc le 1er août 1820 et atteint la ville du Cap. Ne voulant pas connaître l'humiliation que lui réservent sans doute ses ennemis, Henri Ier se donne la mort le 8 octobre 1820. Le corps inanimé est transporté à la citadelle. Le lendemain, la famille royale et quelques fidèles sont arrêtés par le duc Jean-Pierre Richard. Le prince Victor-Henri et d'autres fidèles de la famille royale sont fusillés le 18 octobre 1820. Luc Grimard évoque l'acte final de cette épopée en ces termes. Pour marquer la fin de cet homme sans mesure, pour saluer l'écroulement du plus beau rêve haïtien, pour souligner comme il convenait la disparition de l'animateur le plus génial qu'ait connu notre race depuis les fameux bâtisseurs de pyramides, il eût fallu une explosion de poudrière. Il eût fallu la citadelle tout entière embrasée et ébranlée jusqu'en ses fondements de la formidable salve de ces 300 canons tirant tous à la fois. Il eût fallu enfin l'éruption d'un volcan, mais il y eut ce coup de pistolet et ensuite un silence qui parut éternel. Le silence, en effet, s'est étalé sur l'œuvre de Henri Christophe, dont il ne reste aujourd'hui que les ruines. Merci de m'avoir écouté.
Thank you very much indeed, Joseph. The coins and medals are among the most fascinating survivals of the kingdom and among the most complex as well. For those of you who may have seen a little toolbar covering up some of the translations, we'll make sure that that gets edited out and that you can see the full translations for those of you who are following along with the English there. When we put this webinar as a recording up on our YouTube channel. So don't worry about that, and hopefully you can revisit it if you miss anything. Thank you again very much indeed, Joseph. It's really wonderful that you could be with us. And I hope that we can be in touch in future.
Of course, this is my pleasure whenever, and I take the opportunity to say happy birthday to Nicole. And it's a good pleasure to be with you, and I really appreciate your invitation.
Thank you again. So we will move swiftly on to our final segment, and I'd like now to invite Henry Stoll to the virtual podium. Henry, if you could present yourself. Welcome. Henry Stoll is a PhD candidate in historical musicology at Harvard University. His work addresses topics in the history of opera, Haiti, and the French Atlantic. His doctoral dissertation highlights the important roles of music and mimicry in the early years of Haitian sovereignty by assembling a body of song parody authored by a community of Haitian poets and musicians in the period. And today we're extremely excited because he is going to give us an introduction to music at Christophe's court. And he's been working in close collaboration with the soprano Melissa Joseph to reconstruct music written for Christophe. And so at the end of the talk, we are truly delighted to be joined by Melissa to sing excerpts, I think I'm right in saying, from the Song of the Royal Court of the Queen's Amazons. Henry, I hope you will reveal a little bit more about this. After your talk and before Melissa's performance, it's going to be Nicole who comes back in with a few final words. So it only remains for me to thank you, Henry, and thank you, Melissa, and to thank all of our speakers today and you, our wonderful audience. And with that, I'll hand over to you, Henry.
Thank you so much, Esther, for that very kind introduction, and many thanks to Nicole and to the Courtauld Institute for making this all possible. I'm going to turn on my PowerPoint here. Great. So music, much like painting, architecture, and poetry, became yet another method for Henri Christophe to assert his claims to monarchical authority. Like the kings of old, he had his composers and dance masters, his ballrooms and salons, his theaters with playwrights, directors, set designers, and machinists, his ballets and operas, his songbooks and libretti, and a Royal Academy of Music with professors of violin, clarinet, flute, horn, and bassoon, some hired from abroad, others drawn from the ample supply of native talent. According to those who knew him, Christophe had a love for ceremony and musical extravagance. He frequently entertained himself with music of which he was passionately fond, writes an English surgeon employed by Christophe, and the most popular martial airs, played by the whole band in the court of the palace, appeared to afford him the highest gratification. His family was also musically accomplished. His son, Victor, was known to have performed in the opera house, and his daughters, Améthyste and Athenaire, could sing, paint, dance, and play the piano, guitar, and harp. An English visitor to the Kingdom of Haiti recalls being treated to a harp performance by the Queen and princesses, and later to an opera at the Royal Theatre. As part of my research, I've been assembling the music of early Haiti, and have thus far identified 2 operas, 1 cantata, and dozens of songs written during Christophe's 16-year rule. Today, we shall hear the premiere of one of the songs written for Christophe's court, entitled The Song of the Queen's Royal Amazons. The song was written by Juste Chanlat, an early Haitian man of letters who authored poems, songs, plays, and operas in glorification of the royal family. The song pays homage to Queen Marie-Louise and her guard of Amazons, a corps of 60 female warriors charged with the protection of the queen and princesses. According to a French council to Haiti, the Amazons wore a tunic of blue silk, large satin trousers with gold or silver garters above the knee, and a gold and silver helmet with plumes of ostrich feathers. They were armed with a lance and a bow and arrow, and each day 2 of them stood guard at the palace. Christophe's guards, meanwhile, were named the Royal Dahomes, taking their name from the kingdom in West Africa. Again, we can see how early Haitians called upon the iconographies of Western Europe, West Africa, and the Americas to mastermind a uniquely Caribbean monarchy, informed by European models perhaps, but not beholden to them. The melody of the Song of the Queen's Royal Amazons is borrowed from the French national anthem, or the Marseillaise, written in 1792 by Claude Joseph Rouget de Lille and familiar to all members of Christophe's court. This makes the song a parody, or what musicologists call a contrafactum. These are songs created by replacing one set of lyrics with another. So think, for instance, of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, Baa Baa Black Sheep, and the ABCs. Easy to compose and delightful to sing, song parodies were extremely popular at the Haitian court, appearing in newspapers, treatises, songbooks, and even strung together to form operas. Their ubiquity might be attributed to a few factors. They can be composed without the aid of music notation. They are eminently portable and easily circulated. And at their most successful, they can reconfigure our associations with a given melody. Few Americans, for instance, can recall the English melody from which the American national anthem is derived. Reuniting these parodic texts with their original melodies has allowed me to offer an idea of what the music of Christophe's court may have sounded like. Yet looking back, it might seem unusual that the early Haitians would co-opt the Marseillaise in this way. This was, after all, the anthem of their colonial oppressors. Yet, from the years 1804 to 1820, I've identified 4 parodies of the Marseillaise written in Haiti. 1 for Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and 3 for Henri Christophe. However, with its imagery of old slavery and vile chains, the Marseillaise was a rather fitting anthem for a people throwing off the yoke of slavery, and perhaps a less fitting anthem for the French, who meant these words metaphorically and would continue to operate the slave trade for decades to come. This irony was not lost on the French. Witnesses to the revolution attest to Haitian troops playing Ça ira as the French retreated, and a French general described a painful sentiment produced upon hearing Haitians sing French patriotic anthems. He goes on to ask, "Are we no longer the soldiers of the Republic? Have we become the servile instruments of politics?" The Song of the Queen's Royal Amazons is comprised of 11 verses, though for the sake of time we will hear only the first and the last today. A spirited battle cry heavily reminiscent of the Marseillaise, its refrain goes, "To arms, brave corps, to the strains of Marie, let us fight for the throne and avenge the country." The song proceeds to condemn the French, these contemptible tyrants, it calls them, this iniquitous race. And referring to the Amazons as ardent sisters and the heroines of America, it urges them to strike down Haiti's oppressors. The song also mentions Ferdinand, Henri and Marie-Louise's first son, born in 1794 in what is today Cap-Haïtien. At 9 years old, Ferdinand was sent to Paris to receive a military education, but in a string of perfidious and unknown events, was taken out of school and died in the orphans' hospital on October 7th, 1805. "Most unfortunate Ferdinand," the song laments, "vengeance has demanded your blood." The song goes on to end triumphantly, powerfully exclaiming, "Long live Marie and Henri, the restorers of the new world." And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their attention, and I'll leave it to Melissa Joseph to give the premiere of the song. If you have any questions, do feel free to reach out to me via email. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry, for that wonderful introduction to music from the Kingdom of Haiti. And you know just how excited I am to hear about the work that you're doing on this. And I really think that you're doing very important work in reconstructing these songs. And it's great that you have such a fine collaborator in Melissa. And I'm also really excited to be hosting some of the content that you have been reconstructing on the Femme Rebelle website, which we will be uploading imminently. So if anyone wants to learn more about these songs and hear them, you can do so on the Femme Rebelle website. And just as a reminder, you can find the site at www.fanmrebel.com. So I think that this has been a fitting and fine birthday celebration for Henri Christophe, and a great way to commemorate the legacies of his kingdom on the bicentenary of its fall. I'd like to think that we'd have made Christophe proud. And although we can't give him a canon salute, we can offer him the wonderful gift of song via Melissa. Before Melissa sings us out, I'd like to take this final opportunity to thank all of our wonderful experts this evening, Marlena, Tabitha, Joseph, and Henry, our sponsors and partners at the Courtauld Institute, the Institute for Black Atlantic Research, the Paul Mellon Centre, the Haitian Embassy, and the Haitian Chamber of Commerce, our translator, Siobhan May, my wonderful and incomparable co-host, Esther, and finally, our soprano, Melissa. Merci un pile tout monde. At this point, I'd like to welcome Melissa onto the screen. If I could ask you to unmute and turn your camera on, Melissa. Wonderful. So over to you, Melissa.
Thank you so much. Quoi la tempête